Hi everybody, it's great to be back here again. Tomorrow's Friday, Parashat Shlach. Yes, the spies and many other topics here in the portion. The political situation in Israel is quite interesting, obviously, and after we've been through a war and now very interesting politics to talk about a little bit, I'd like to really begin our lesson with a verse talking about the Messianic period where it's brought down. I'll read the verse in Zechariah chapter 8, verse number 23. And the verse says like this, Ko amah Hashem tzvakot, thus says the Lord of hosts, Bayamim hahema, in those days, asher yachziku, 10 nashim mikol lishonot hagoyim, 10 men of all the lishonot literally means it can be the languages of the nations, it means in the nations. V'chziku b'chnaf ish Yehudi, they'll grab hold of a Jew's corner of his garment. Leimol nelechai imachem, we will go with you. Ki shamanu Elohim imachem, we heard that God is with you. And here I'm holding up the kanaf, the corners of our garments, the Tzizit. So this prophecy is, of course, a fascinating prophecy. We have to understand it, and many, of course, are thinking about it today when there's a massive movement of many non-Jews to return to the lights of Torah through the people of Israel. Israel has the purpose of being a light of the nations. And obviously the prophet here in Zechariah is reflecting on this great period of time in the end of days and the Messianic period, which we are living in now, where they will grab hold of the garments of the Jew. Interesting, Yehudi. Right? It doesn't say Israel, it says Yehudi, which is really interesting that we're talking about learning again from from our Jewish way, literally to the Jews, right? Because Israel has I'm trying to get at is Israel has a much wider connotation. There are 12 tribes, and today the tribes that we see are Judah and Benjamin, right? They're all part of Judah, basically. We know that we have other tribes as well, so it's so connected to today. Because right now the tribes are not coming back yet; they're beginning to return. We're working on that. So we're talking about the Jew, right, from the tribe of Judah as well, you could say, which is around today, which is fascinating. So that's going to cause the awakening and returning to us, and of course that will bring back the 4 tribes. But the question I want to focus on is why the grabbing hold of the garment, the tzitzit? What does it have to do with why did they choose something else? They could have chose grabbing hold of our yarmulke, our kippot, our shoulders, but the grabbing hold of the garment, the tzitzit, which is a fascinating thing. And I'd like to open up with a very powerful story brought down in the Talmud. It's a very, very, powerful story. I mean, some of your hair may stand up when I read this story, but it's something, the Torah, what's fascinating in the Torah is not shy. The Torah will talk about sins people have done. Like King David, for example, when he sinned, it's mentioned, or many other cases. I gave an example that stands out, of course, the story of Bathsheba. But the Talmud, and here we are to learn, and the Talmud brings down sometimes very, very powerful stories in order to shake us up to reality. And this is a fascinating story, but it's still very, very explicit. But I want to read the story anyway. And it's brought down in the Tractate of Menachot 44a. It says like this, Amar Rabbi Natan. Rabbi Natan says, Ein lecha kol mitzvah kala shektuva b'Torah. There is no easier commandment that's written in the Torah. She'ein matan schara b'olam hazeh u'le'olam haba. In other words, there is no easy commandment written in the Torah. It doesn't have reward in this world and in the future world. Eini yodea kama. I don't know how much. But now he's talking about say u'lemad mitzvah tzitzit. Let's give an example now. Let's learn for the commandment of tzitzit, right? Rabbi Natan's giving that example. Maseh b'adam achad. He's telling a story about a man. Shaya zahir b'mitzvah tzitzit. He was very, very careful in fulfilling all the requirements of the commandment of tzitzit. Shama sheyesh zonah b'krachei hayam. He heard that there was a harlot across the sea. Shenotelet 400 zehuvim b'schora. She was this harlot was taking a lot of money for her services, 400 gold zehuvim coins. Shigel 400 zehuvim v'kabal hazman. So what did he do? This person who was very careful with the commandment of tzitzit, he sends her the payment through credit card, whatever it was in those days, and he's ready to roll. He says, he made an appointment with her, and he's on his way. Kishegiya zmano, when it was his turn, ba v'yashav ala petach. He's standing by the entrance. And here the Talmud is very explicit about this whole incident of the harlot. Nichnesa shivchata ve'amrala. So her maidservant comes and tells her, I'm sorry, the woman, Oto Adam sheshigelach 400 zuvim ba v'yashav ala petach. So she tells her boss, which was a harlot, basically, and she tells her, listen, this guy that paid you this amount of money is here now, he arrived. Amrahi, so she told her servant to tell her, he shall enter. Yikanes nichnas, and he enters. Hitzia lo sheva mitos. So what does this harlot do? She prepares 7 different beds. Sheish shel kesef ve'echad shel zahav. 6 of them were out of silver, and the 7th was of gold. Ubein kol echad ve'echad sulam. And between each of these beds, she places a ladder. So it was on different levels, and a ladder from each bed going up to a higher level. Shel kol echad sulam shel kesef. And in between each one of them, apparently there was a ladder of silver between all the 7 beds. I'm sorry, 6 out of the 7 beds, right? So again, she set up 7 beds, and 6 were of silver, 1 of gold, and between ben kol achad v'achad, there was a ladder between all of them, between all these beds. Now, I'm just trying to figure out if it was like one big high bunk bed that go into the top, or it was just spread out. But anyway, whatever it was, there were these ladders, and the last ladder was from gold. Okay? The last ladder was from gold. And she goes on, the Gemara to tell us, Ubein kol echad ve'echad sulam, we read that, Alta v'yashva al gabei elyona, k'shi aruma. So she goes up, and she's basically, apparently it's one after the other, like high bunk beds, and she goes all the way to the top, and she is totally naked on the top bed, the Talmud tells us. Okay? And she's up there. And he goes up also, not dressed, to the next door. Bao, and all of a sudden what happens? Bao arba tzitziyotav v'tavchu lo al panav. So all of a sudden, his 4 tzitziot of his garment comes over and starts to slap him in the face. He feels the strings of tzitziot hitting him in the face. Nishmat v'yashav lo agabe kakos. He jumps down off the bed and he goes all the way down to the ground. V'av hi nishmita v'yashva agabe kakos. So she comes down with him and she's sitting on the ground with him. Amralo gapa shel Romi. She says to him, and she's swearing in the name of the minister of Rome. Sheini minichatcha ad shetomar li ma mum ra'ita bi. She goes, I'm not going to let you go home until you tell me what flaw did you see in me. What did I do wrong? So she's taking an offense that he's turned off to this harlot, thinking that she's the problem. And that's what she tells him. Amal, and he goes and says to her, Ha'avodah shelo ra'iti isha yafa kamotech. He goes, no, it's not true. I never saw a more beautiful woman in my life, he says to her. El mitzvah achad tzivanu Hashem Elokeinu. But she goes, one commandment God commanded us, v'tzitzit shma, and the name of the commandment is to fulfill the tzitziot. Fulfill the commandment of wearing these tzitziot on our garments. Uktivba, and it's written over there in the Torah regarding the tzitziot, Ani Hashem Elokeichem, shtei pamid, says, I am the Lord your God, twice. Ani hu shatid lipara, v'ani hu shatid l'shalem sachar. I am the God who will punish, I will give a reward. Achshav nidmu alai ke'al beidim. He goes, now, these 4 tzitziot that I have, these 4 fringes, became like, he said, 4 witnesses over here. Amralo, she says to him, Eni minichacha ad shetomar li ma shemcha u'ma shem yecha u'ma shem rabcha u'ma shem midrashcha she'ata lomed bo Torah. So she says, I'm not letting you go until you tell me, what is your name? Where do you come from? Who's your rabbi? What school do you learn? And she wants to know all the details about this young student. And she wants to know. She's not going to let him go until you tell me all the details. Katav v'natan biyada. So he writes them all down. And he gives it to her, puts it in her hand. Amda v'chilka kol nechaseh. So she gets up. She's a very wealthy harlot. And she gives away all her possessions. Shlish l'malchut. She gives away 1/3 to Rome at that time. And Rashi explains why to Rome, because she had to convince them that she wants to make a change in her life and they wouldn't be upset with her. So she gave 1/3 of her wealth to Rome. Shlish Laniyim, the other third to the poor people, and the other third she took with her. Chutz me'otan matzot, except for her special beds that she had. Matzot means the matzot means the what she would cover the bed with. The linen of the beds. Ubat lebeit midrasho, and she comes to the Beit Midrash, the house of study, the yeshiva of Rabbi Chia, one of the great giants. She comes over and she says, Amralo Rabbi. She says, Rabbi, tziva alai v'yasuni giyorot. I want you to have people turn. I want to be Jewish. Just make the commandment, let the people come over here, give the orders, and convert me. That's what she asked in the rabbi. Amala biti shemeinayich natat be'echad min hatalmidim. So he says, maybe you put your eyes on one of our students. He tells the woman, Hotzia ktav miyada. So she takes out the letter that the guy wrote, wrote whose name was, where he comes from. V'nanalo, and she gives it to the rabbi. Amala lechi zaki b'mikrei. So the rabbi says to go ahead and take possession of your purchase. Otan matzot she'etzia lo b'isor. Now the bedding that you spread for in a prohibition, in sin, etzia lo bet, and now do it in permission. In other words, do it with being allowed to do something like that. Zem matan schobos. This is the gift in this world and the world to come. I don't know how much more. In other words, the rabbi now gave his permission, he gave his blessing for this wedding to take place, and it turned into a love story, and they got married, lived happily ever after. But the powerful message over here, we learn a very, very powerful message. Number one, I connect right away. Interesting how that the story of the Tzizit brought back this Gentile woman, and she actually wants to join the house of Israel, which is reminding of the prophecy in Zechariah. And of course, on a much simple understanding besides that, which is interesting connection, of course, is the powerful commandment of the Tzizit. We see that there's something very intrinsic when regarding the commandment of Tzizit that acts as a protection device from, God forbid, a person falling into the dark side, falling into his temptations, into his lustful temptations. And that's very, very important to understand what is this all about. And the reason, of course, we're bringing down Tzitziot, I brought down Zechariah, and bring the story down. Obviously, this week's portion ends with talking about the Tzitzit, right? The commanding of doing the Tzitzit. And I want to somehow connect it to what's going on and try to bring that all together. Why is it brought down in this week's portion? And it's very important to understand that. But first, if we look, Tzitzit is a very interesting commandment. Number one, we have to wear as a garment on our four corners, right? So we have to tie the fringes. And we have altogether 8 strings and 5 knots, right? Which we'll talk about the meaning of that in a moment. Besides that, we have the tchelet, the blue thread, right? Over here, many today do not wear the blue thread. Now it's beginning to become popular again because it was lost in exile. Now it's coming back. So the blue thread as well, as it says, you will look at the blue thread. And I want to talk about the blue thread as well a little bit, as well. So what is this whole thing? It's fascinating. This takes us back. In order to understand a little bit more about the Tzitziot, we have to go way back in time. And if we look in the verse in the Bible, if we look in Genesis 2, verse number 25 says, "Vayu shneim arumim ha'adam ve'ishto ve'lo yitboshashu." Man and woman were totally naked and they were not embarrassed. This goes way back before they sinned from the eating of the tree, knowledge of good and evil. They were not embarrassed. What does that mean they weren't embarrassed? And Rashi says something very, very powerful. You have to understand what Rashi says. Rashi says they weren't embarrassed. Shelo hayu yodim derech tzniut lavchin bein tov lera. What does that mean? They didn't. Literally means they didn't understand the ways of tzniut, of being, of knowing good and evil. In other words, Rashi says they weren't at all had the necessity to understand being careful, being embarrassed about Mother Nature, because they were so totally on a high spiritual plane that for them it wasn't at all a problematic thing not wearing garments. The Al-Shech, one of the great commentaries, adds, and he says like this, he says, Ki mehit batkutam b'kedusha, because they were cleaving to holiness. ובדברים עליונים, in high things, ולא בחלק חומר ויצרה, they weren't at all cleaving to materialism and the evil urge. לא ידעו מהות ואיכות הרע, they didn't have any concept what the essence of evil was. בכן לא היה להם איברי המשגל ביניהם, כי אם כאוזניים וידיים ודומיהם. So the sexual organs for them were like hands and ears and eyes. There was no difference. כי גם בהזדווגם לא היה להם הדבר לפועל מגונה. For them as well, having relations together, marital relations, wasn't at all for them anything at all to be condemned in any way. It wasn't a bad thing to be embarrassed of, for people even seeing them. It was like eating and drinking for them. So he's saying something very interesting. At that time, the coming together as man and woman wasn't at all something that to be embarrassed of. It was a natural thing that they have no evilness within that act of that relation between them, which was a fascinating kind of thing. So what happens? When did it all change? Well, it all changes when they eat of the tree. And then right away, if you look in chapter 3, verse number 6 and 7, it says, "Vatea yisha ki tova eitz." The woman saw that the tree was good, and for the eyes, and nechmad eitz laskil, and then whatever she took for the fruit, she gave it to her husband. And then right away, it says in verse number 7 in chapter 3, it says, their eyes opened up, and they knew that they were naked, and they made themselves these fig outfits out of fig leaves. And they made themselves belts. So right away, the first thing they do after they sinned was they realized that they were naked. What do you mean they realized before they were? They not they didn't know they were naked, but now there was something that was aroused. Now, and our deep sources, our Kabbalistic sources talk about here as the terrible force of evil now was released. Beforehand it was contained. And now that force was released and became intrinsic to them, which became much harder to rectify. And I'm not going to go there, I'm not explaining the whole thing of the sin of the first man, but to realize that this goes way back to the garden, this concept of where we see that the source of all evil we know stems from the sexual sins, from the sexual, what's the word I'm looking for? Transactions. Those terrible sins that people are led towards sexual sins is the source of all evil. Much more than everything. A lot of things are, of course, are connected with a lot of other evils in the world, but that is a very powerful source of evil, and it all began with that. As we can see, now they felt naked. Now they felt there was something wrong, because now they had a different kind of desire. It wasn't a desire before to bond and connect. And I don't want to get me wrong over here. Jews, in Judaism, we believe very strongly that the connection of man and woman is a connection. It's a beautiful connection of husband and wife when it's done in proper love and bonding, to bring to bring progeny, to bring people to the world, to as we say in Hebrew, to make the world grow and prosper in that way, and also to bond together, as a spiritual love between husband and wife. That's 100% kosher, as long as it's done according to the rules. People are married, etc., the time of the month, when you're allowed to, when you're not allowed to, according to the rules and all that kind of thing. So it becomes a holy act. But when it's, God forbid, profaned, and people do it just for their lust and running after the pleasures of terrible things that we all know about, unfortunately, it's a world of terrible problems in that area. That kind of thing is, of course, the source of all evil. That's what evil, but not, God forbid, the connection of husband and wife and man and woman together as when they're supposed to do, of course, and that's a blessed thing. So let's please separate between those two things, because Judaism is not a monk sitting in some kind of monastery far away and saying, that they have to live alone because they can't be together as husband and wife. I just wanted to clarify that, of course. But here we're talking about the source of all evil when it's done for the wrong reasons and just for the pleasure of that sexual pleasure and desire, which leads to terrible, terrible tragedy in the world. And we don't have to look far around us what's going on in the world, and the source of so many problems because of the lack of sexual control and boundaries. And that's so important. We're going to get to that in a moment. Now, if we take this concept and we look, it's so fascinating. In Hebrew language, of course, says it all. In Hebrew, the language for garment is lavush, means beged, right? Lavush, is one of the words. Comes to the word to be embarrassed. bosh, to be embarrassed. So the root of the word, every Hebrew word has a root to it. So levush comes to the word meaning to be embarrassed. In other words, the idea of the concept of clothes is because someone's embarrassed, they have to wear a garment. Beged means to rebel, the same thing. It comes from the sin, right? Beged means a garment also in Hebrew. There's a few different words for garment. It comes from the word to rebel. So also, it stemmed from, the need to wear garments stemmed from that very first sin. Or me'il. Me'il is a jacket. A jacket comes from me'ilah, when it's also kind of rebellion in Hebrew. So it's fascinating that the three words that are very, very, that I can think of right now, that stand out for garments, all have a connotation for roots of rebellion and embarrassment, because that's the source of where a garment comes from. It's also interesting, is that if we look around the entire world, it's a very, very universal thing that everyone wears clothes. No one runs around in their birthday suits unless they're crazy. So we're not animals, we're human beings, and we know that we have to be careful, we have to have a protection. So the garment really has become, after the sin, a way of protecting ourselves. We have to, first, a regular garment because it protects a person. It gives a couple of layers of protection, not to go up and fall into that sin, so people are protected. That's a very, very interesting understanding, and we see how the words themselves actually apply to that concept. Now, after understanding this concept, we can go in further a little bit deeper into this whole thing. The tzitziot, wearing the tzitziot, as we said before, I mentioned they have 8 strings. Okay? The 8 strings and 5 knots. What are the 8 strings? The 8 strings represent, we know that in Judaism there's a number, the concept of numbers is very powerful. 7 represents the physical world, 6 days of the week, and Shabbat is the highest level of the 7th in the physical world where we rest. The 8th represents a step forward. It represents the above nature, right? That's the tzitziot, 8 representing above nature. We have to look above nature. We have to overcome temptation. We have to go above the natural way of the world. Because the natural thing for people after the first sin, after the sin of the first man, falling into that terrible mode and evil being released in the world, which has a purpose. Evil is there for us to work hard in this world and rectify it. But what gives us the ability to overcome is our going above nature. That reminds us of the circumcision on the 8th day, because why is a person circumcised? It's also to remind us, that who we are, a covenant of circumcision, and not for a person to lose himself in that way. So that's supposed to be another step for us to remind ourselves in that who we are and how do we take care of ourselves, and not, God forbid, lose our boundaries. So we spoke about the 8 strings and the meaning of 8. Of course, 8 has the 8 garments of the high priest. There are many things that show how the 8 represents that above nature situation. On the 8th day of the organization of the tabernacle, there are many things I can go on, of course, and as well. So that is the meaning of 8. It's very, very high. It brings us to a very high plane. In addition, there are 5 knots on the tzitziot. The 5 knots represent the 5 books of the Torah. The Torah represents that's our backbone. That is our ability to overcome our temptations in order for us to be able to live a life of boundaries. We need this. We all know together that the tzitziot represents the 613 commandments. As everyone knows, the famous thing, tzitziot represents 613 commandments. And it's supposed to remind us of the commandments. Why do we need so many commandments for? Why do we have so many commandments? And the answer is that gives us the boundaries. It controls us. It gives us the proper way in order to control our desires and focus ourselves. That's why the necessity of the commandments came about as a result later on of the sin of the first man, because the first man had very few commandments. But after that sin took place in the world, there was a necessity, of course, to bring down for the high spiritual world the 613 commandments to give us the proper moral and spiritual boundaries we need in this world. And that's really where that comes from. The tzitziot represent those boundaries. Now, it's something fascinating. I'd like to bring down another source. The Talmud talks about the fact that the tzitziot represents the colors. Like what is a tchelet supposed to mean? And this is something really interesting. I'd like to mention this as well. Hayar Rabbi Meir Omer, it's brought down also in Menachot, in the tractate of Menachot 43, and it says, "Ma nishtanat tchelet mikol minei tzivonim." Why do we have, this color of tchelet in our tzitziot, why is it different than all the other colors? Because tchelet is like the color of the sea. And the sea is like the color of the heavens. And the heavens is like the color of God's throne. And he brings down some verses and he explains this. Now, what does that all mean? And I saw a beautiful explanation in the words of the Kli Yakar, one of the commentaries on the Bible. And he says something really fascinating. And he says something, and I'd like to read part of what he says. He says, he brought down out in this week's portion in chapter 15, on verse number 38, the Kli Yakar, and he says like this. He says, "Vasulem tzitzit, you shall make tzitziot." Kol tochen ha-parashat tzorch because this entire portion needs explanation. Ki ech yizkor et kol ha-mitzvot Hashem al yidei shistakel b'chut shel tchelet. He goes, how are we going to remember all the commandments by looking at just one blue? V'nireh lefaresh, he goes, I'd like to explain like this. Einyan b'shnei derachim. He wants to explain it in two ways. Haderech harishon hu al derech shemu b'sifri. He brought down a midrash. Amar lo Kadosh Baruch LeMoshe, אמור לעם ישראל, הסתכלו בשמיים שבראתי לשמשכם, שמא שינו מידתם, או שם עלה גלגל חמה מן המערב. So what is he saying? Look at the heavens. You see how the heavens are so steady and steadfast, and that they don't change. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west. The same thing. Again, the way the sun comes up. We see how nature runs its course. So it's bringing down the story of the sun rising and the sun setting. And then he says the same thing with the sea. We look at the sea. We see that God has placed boundaries, it says in Jeremiah, to the sea. Shema shina midato. Did it change its midah? Did it change its way? No. There are boundaries of the sea and there are boundaries of the heavens. And so here the beautiful thing we have to see, and this is a powerful thing, he brings down that to example. We have to see that when we're looking at the tchelet, and we're thinking about the sea, how the sea is contained and has boundaries and follows the rules of nature, and it doesn't break those rules, right? The water has a certain level. Look what happens when once in a while there's an earthquake and the water is forced out of the sea. And what happens? And tsunamis and all kinds of things like that. Or in the heavens, right, unleash. So we know that the importance of boundaries are so important, and you have to look at those boundaries. And as we look close and we follow the sea, we see how the boundary, we see how the heavens, everything is working in a perfect order. And then we go forward to a high level, we're able to focus on the throne of God and realizing our boundaries in this world, how important those boundaries are. I also thought of the fact that the sea is something that's hidden, right? You can see in a way that we have to, in the sea, we don't know what's going on in the bottom of the sea, right? The voyage to the bottom of the sea. It's hard to tell what's going on at the bottom. The heavens, far out galaxies, it's so far from us, and they're hidden in a way. And that concept is to realize that the tzitziot, are protecting us, surrounding us, protecting what's within inside. Our spiritual nature has to be protected, etc. Very, very powerful concept. But I thought that was a fascinating comparison. We see the importance of boundaries. And it connects what we're saying, the rebelling against these boundaries, the meaning of garment is beged, will bring, God forbid, about the terrible, terrible tragedy. Because when people sin in the terrible way, and then the world loses its boundaries. Look what happened in Sodom and Gomorrah, what happened, and the sexual boundaries were totally perverted, and etc. We see this societies were destroyed over the lack of boundaries in these areas. And boundaries are important. That's what the whole beauty of commandments are, to have those proper boundaries. And if we take this concept, and I want to go a little further with this concept, and we look in Isaiah, and I thought this is an interesting understanding, because in Hebrew the word tzitzit comes from to see, right? The word tzitz is to look out, and to look, and we remember when we look at the tzitziot, we are trying to rectify our eyes. We want to look at the proper holy things, and not, God forbid, when people are destroying their eyes by looking at things they shouldn't be looking at, and arousing desires they shouldn't be arousing, and going in the wrong direction. That brings a person away from true spirituality. That's why only a true tzaddik, a righteous person, are the ones that have true closeness to God. Because they are the ones who have total control over their midot, over their ways, their boundaries in their life. And that is the most important thing in this world. We're producing boundaries and behaving morally and properly. And that makes and breaks a person in this world. Now, I want to bring down, first of all, a verse in Isaiah. And Isaiah brings down, well, before we go to Isaiah, I think I want to go to the spies. We have to connect this to the spies I mentioned. If we look in regarding the spies, it says, "Vayotziu dibat haaretz asher taru ota," and the spies spoke bad about the land. Asher taru, what does taru mean? That they actually went out to explore, using their eyes to see. They saw things in the wrong way, right? And they were talking about the giants, and they're talking. It's very fascinating, talking about anshe midah. Midah, one of the words that the word in Hebrew means boundaries, right? It comes from the same word meaning boundaries, and they actually use that same word, the word midah. If we look in the verse in the sin, but now I want to go back for a moment and to see what the Bible, when it talks about the spies, who they were, right? It says in chapter 13, verse number 3, "Vayishlach otam Moshe mimidbar Paran al pi Hashem kulam anashim rashei bnei Yisrael." They were all leaders of Israel. Who were these spies? They were great leaders of Israel. And we know what that means. What does it mean, the great leaders of Israel? They were, the Baal HaTurim says, they were Sarei Chamishim, they were the ministers of 50. They were very high officers. Now, Chamishim could hint to the 5 books of Torah. They were great Torah scholars, as we all know. So what happened? How did these great Torah scholars be the ones to talk bad about the land? And it's unbelievable. How can they talk about it? As it says in verse number 32, Anshe Midot, saying we saw these Anshe Midot, great people of great Midot, means, again, Midot could mean good character traits, but the opposite, talking about physical size, they were huge. What happened? Why did they sin for? Now, one of the explanations, which is a common explanation, which is so true and important to mention, you might have not heard of it, is that they were so happy with their the way they were in the desert. They were living in the desert. They had the man come down. Everything was given to them. They had everything served to them on a silver platter. They were afraid of the challenges. They were afraid of the midot. And here I want to use what I connected what I was saying before. They were afraid of the midot. Midot are boundaries. They didn't want to come to a land where we have to create the boundaries. They enjoyed their boundaries being inside the hothouses of the desert, being taken care of. They didn't want to go and contend with the new boundaries by placing boundaries on the land. That's why it's fascinating. The first commandment, right, when Joshua entered the land, they had to first conquer the land and divide the land into boundaries. We see again the concept of midot, of boundaries over here. And it was all a concept of boundaries. They were afraid to contend. So a lot of times the best way to contend with evil force in the world, they have to deal with these evil forces to capture the land, to relinquish the land from the klipot, from the husks that are hovering over the land, right? All that is to take away the evil and build God's palace and kingdom in the land of Israel. So they were afraid, no, let's stay in the desert, right? It's much easier they don't want to get involved in that. And that lack of involvement, of course, is an easy way out. And that was a sin, and they actually spoke bad about the land. The land is the Malchut, the queen. The man is literally the unification, right? When they unified Israel and its country together in unison. It's a marriage between Israel and the land of Israel. Just like the Torah is under the Torah, Israel stood, and we were the bride receiving Torah. The same thing, the land, we have that special relationship with the land of Israel, and they were rebelling against that concept of the land. Why? Because they were talking about, again, the boundaries. They were afraid of the boundaries. They were afraid of losing it. All kinds of commandments we got to do in the land of Israel. We have to contend with the wars that are going on. The Canaanites over there, Israel will be lured into all kinds of problems. They were living there, and there were a lot of problems of idol worship. They were all afraid of all those things. Oh, let's remain in the desert. And they lured the entire nation into this trap that were crying what's going to be, and it ended up being the day of destruction of our temples. A terrible thing happened of the sin. So we see that, again, the concept of the sin of the spies is connected to the boundaries. That's why, what is the connection to this portion all of a sudden talking about the tzitziot? To realize that on one hand, we must have our boundaries, remembering the commands of Hashem, it's so important, it's a powerful thing. But on the other hand, to realize that doesn't mean that we can't live a full life of enjoying the world, of building the land, of coming here and building the physical land of Israel, and that beautiful relationship of unification together of the land and its people. And with all the challenges, we have to use the Torah to be a vessel to uplift it, but not to say we're going to live like monks, hiding ourselves in an incubator, The same way man and wife, a person says, oh, am I going to get married now because they're, no, the opposite. When a person and husband are married, that beautiful unification of holiness that brings him to a higher level, but not to someone oversteps his boundaries when he's looking outward and destroying his family. But your family, your wife, and obviously should be the most important thing in your life, and that together you should build a life of harmony with your family. And when trouble happens, you should overextend your boundaries going out of your home. And that is the concept here of the Spies, how it connects, because it's all about how we deal with our boundaries. Now, taking this concept back to what I opened up with, first I want to mention again Isaiah, because that I didn't get to. I want to go back to the verse in Isaiah. Isaiah brings down in chapter 28, and he's talking about the crown. He says, Hoi ateret geut, shikorei Ephraim. He's talking about the crown of arrogance that the drunkard ones of Ephraim, Tzizit novel, they're wearing this crown which is falling apart. Asher al rosh gei shmanim halumei yain, which is on the heads of those that are, again, I said shikorim, we say in Hebrew, drunkards from what? What is he trying to say? They can picture Ephraim having a crown on their head, but it's on the head of those who have greasing their hair with oil. In other words, that they are totally not living up to what the crown really means. And then God said God's going to bring down, it says, V'hinei chazak v'amitz l'Hashem kizerem barad. God's going to bring this powerful flow of hail, like a stormy hail, a storm of katev, of destruction, that is going to bring the crown down to the ground. Beraglaim teramasna, and they're going to be, the crown is going to be trampled upon. Geut, the arrogance of Ephraim. Again, it's talking about the sins of Israel, the 10 tribes, when they were expelled from the land, of what they did. Vaitat tzitzit novel tzvitefato. So we're talking about the crown. Now, tzitzit is the same word as tzitzit here. In Hebrew, it could also mean a crown, not only the garment, but a crown. Ashel al rosh gei shmanim, which is on the heads of those. Why is it called the Valley of Fatness? Because the valley, the crown is on the head. So the head itself looks like a valley compared to the crown, which is up. It's like the valley part. And he's saying, kivekura beterem kayit. It's like a fig. Before they did the whole, when you cut the figs, in Israel we have a lot of fig trees. So when you're cutting the first figs, they're coming out. Asher yireh haroeh. When a person sees these figs, when he's starting the season of picking the figs, and he has one in his hand, he starts swallowing it right away. He can't control himself. He has to eat the pig because it's so, attractive to him. So the same way, their crowns are going to come off so quickly. And then it talks about that day, how God is going to be lateret tzvi l'tzviatifa. God is going to be a crown l'sharmo for the rest of the nation. Ruach mishpat is going to bring the spirit of mishpat, justice, and the spirit of might for those who are in battle. Now, why don't I bring down Isaiah? Because Isaiah here is talking about the crown. The crown is, in Hebrew, the keter is the highest level. But here the crown is being defiled. Because of what? Because of their actions, the lack of boundaries, of over drinking. And the same word for crown is also tzitzit. Why? Because the tzitzit represents, where is it located? We wear it on our garment, and it literally surrounds our lower extremities, right? Our sexual organs are literally covered with our, covered with our tzitziot, because surrounding the bottom part of us, which is the lower portion of man, right? Men are obligated, obviously the Jewish men are obligated to wear tzitziot. So that garment itself that is protecting us is trying to say, remember who you are, right? That has to be lifted up to the crown. We have to take our physical desires and uplift it to the throne. We spoke about the throne of God. That's the true crown. And that's when we look at the tzitziot, we look at the thread. That's supposed to remind us of the throne and go up to a high place and rectify ourselves. But if we're not, God forbid, it's going to be thrown on the floor, be trampled. And that is when people totally, unfortunately, lack self-control. What happens at the end, their crowns will be trampled. There'll be nothing. So this is connected. It's known. The connection, the highest level of a person is when he uplifts his lower portions of his body. Because it's very easy for a person to uplift his intellect or in that faction of a human being, it's much easier. But when a person has control over his most earthly desires, that is the hardest work a human being has in this world. And when he's able to lift that up, then he's really, really wearing the crown. That's why it's so deep. He's really wearing the crown. That's the hardest work he has in this world. And it's much easier. People, okay, when we're all sitting inside the incubators, as I spoke about the spies, that's fine. They can be inside the incubators in the desert studying Torah, and they're all fine. But the minute you release them, they're out of it. They're afraid. They can fall apart, and they're not controlling themselves. Because once they enter the world, there's a big world out here. You can fall apart. That's why you have to lift the boundaries to your head. That's making a true crown. And that is what Isaiah is talking about. Now let's get back to the beginning. The nations of the world at the end of days, the Messianic time is here. We are here. Everyone, wake up. We're here. It's happening. The world is turning to Israel. Israel's a light to the nations. And what's bringing them in is to see how Israel has the boundaries. Israel has the boundaries of its land. Of course, God willing, our boundaries have to extend to all our boundaries that are given in a rightful way to the land of Israel. All our tribes have to come back to the land. So these are boundaries. We know what our land is all about. We're struggling for it today. In politics, of course, we're constantly dealing in the political situation in the world. At the same time, our spiritual boundaries have to be known. And these spiritual boundaries are what makes us the people of Israel. And when we lose our spiritual boundaries, just the same days that the government here was made in Israel, another gay parade in the holy city of Jerusalem. Where are our spiritual boundaries? I mean, it's unbelievable. It's hard to believe people are losing the moral way of the Torah is all about. People are afraid to talk about it, afraid to speak out against it. And it's a major problem. Because when you lose boundaries and people are creating their own boundaries, they can end up, unfortunately, literally destroying family, destroying our society. And that is what we're returning. We have to return back to Torah boundaries, which will bring a blessing to mankind. This is what the nation of the world will find in Israel, because the culture of the world is turning to pot. Everyone is, look at Hollywood and all this culture, and blocking people out. They're supposed to speak in democracy, and they're blocking WhatsApp phones of people because they're speaking out. People are not allowed to say what they want. Lack of free speech. Only when you are progressive, liberal, you can say what you want. But you can't when you're talking from spirituality and from religion, because they're totally opposed to all this. This is the boundaries the world needs. And again, this has to be done through love of mankind. And not people are afraid. They're afraid of religion. Oh, you guys are crazy. The opposite. People who are truly religious people who care about the world's benefit. They want to reach out. They want to do things in peace through true education, to reach out. It's the only way to really educate. And to learn and see the light of the Torah. That will rectify us. We have to pull away from these terrible sins, from this terrible lack of boundaries that are causing the world to be turned upside down. The corona, all these things are happening because of our lack of boundaries. And Israel is supposed to be that light source. And that's why God is telling us, the day will come when the nations will turn to the Jew and they'll grab all we want, Tzizit, right? We want what represents that boundaries, those boundaries, that connection to God, that will bring about a true redemption to the world. And this is what we're all waiting for, and this is what's happening. We're living in very special times. These are, for sure, the times, as we say in Hebrew, Mashiach, and the world needs it. It needs to be rectified. Have a beautiful Shabbat, and I hope the message was clear. Let this follow us, because as we say, the Shabbat gives us strength always for the following week. So we say, Shabbat Shalom, and it will bring us a beautiful blessing for our entire following week as well. So that's why it's so important for Shabbat to be that, we said, the level of 7 coming in, and that level brings us to energy, what we need to go further. And as we said before, the 8th level is so powerful that we have to think about going beyond nature. That gives us the strength to reach the highest heights there are. Shabbat Shalom, B'sorot Tovot, Yeshua Benechamot. Bye-bye.